So those first impressions, as I've said, they really count. So I come back to the title, and I decided that, well, actually, the basic was there so that I could tell you that the education actually shouldn't be basic. Okay. But it should be adapted to the eating habits of the family. It should inform the family about the relationship between food, activity, and insulin. And it should build foundations for future education. We often think about the basic components of education about food, and as dietitians, we like to talk about food groups. And sometimes it is helpful, sometimes it isn't helpful. You will all have your own way within your own areas of how you demonstrate the different food groups. But if we're going to talk about whole food education, then we need to think about what we say about each of these food groups. And they are all important for childhood nutrition, because we are not just dealing with the blood glucose level, we're dealing with the growth and the development of a child, we're dealing with their relationship with food, and we want them to grow up to have a healthy relationship with food. So for each food group, what we need to think about is what information do we provide about how much does that young child or young person need to have, how do those foods impact on the blood glucose level, and when to eat them. So if you have a toddler who drinks milk all night, then you need to focus some of the education on the importance of not drinking milk all night because of its impacts on blood glucose levels. If you have an adolescent who consumes very little milk, you might want to focus on introducing some milk or dairy foods to ensure that they're getting sufficient calcium for bone health. When we think about fruit and vegetables, we know that the consumption of fruit and vegetables is important for general health and also glycemic management. So again, how much do you need to consume? When is the best time to eat these foods? And what do they do to the blood glucose responses? And we also need to make sure that we deal with any myths around those foods. So I seem to spend a lot of time saying you can eat bananas and you can eat grapes. It seems to be a UK myth. You can't have those if you have diabetes, they're bad for you. In terms of protein, we need to, from the beginning, think about what is protein there for, when should children be eating it, but also get people to start to understand that it may have an impact on the glucose response that they see. We may not be teaching them to count it in any way, but we need to teach them to recognise that it impacts on glucose levels. And we need to check that they're consuming an appropriate amount of protein for growth. And then I've left carbohydrate till last. It's the thing we spend the most time thinking about. But it's really important that we think not just about teaching people how to manage carbohydrate, but to teach them about how much they need to eat and when they need to eat it. For those of you who were in Carmel's session this morning, as she said, give people a guide to a minimum and a maximum amount of carbohydrate at a meal. That often hugely helps the smaller children, the parents of, because then they realise that actually they don't have to give as much food as they might have been trying to give. We know that carbohydrate requirements vary. We know that where there is a concern about achieving a total energy intake and food availability, you are going to need to have a higher percentage of energy from carbohydrate. Okay? So it's about assessing what is the right amount for that child at that moment in time. Our carbohydrate education, well, it is essential for all, but as we already heard, it does need to sit with the insulin that's used. It must also promote food quality and not just quantity. We may be talking about consistency and timing of food, particularly for a twice daily regimen. When do you need to have your meals? Is food required to prevent hypoglycemia? And we may be talking about amount and dose calculation for those on MDI or a pump. I'm not going to talk to you about how to carbohydrate count because Carmel did that this morning. But I am going to say to you that what's in the recommendations, where it says grams, portions or exchanges, They are not the only ways to quantify carbohydrates. And there are lots of other systems out there, and I'm sure that many of you sitting in this room have developed your own local ways of quantifying carbohydrates, whether it's using cup measures, whether it's using the hand. It does not matter how you teach the carbohydrate quantification. What matters is that it's consistent and it works for those families that you are dealing with. Okay? And as soon as we have more evidence to show that a hand method works, promise you it will go in the next lot of guidelines. Okay? So use or develop the methods that are most appropriate to your population. We do now have a nutrition area on the websites within the membership, so if you want access to other resources, if you think there might be somewhere up the road that has information that could be useful for your population, join the group, because we're going to be posting resources to share on forums. We also have to talk about how that whole food, that carbohydrate, may affect the glucose differently to another carbohydrate food. If you eat breakfast cereal, you tend to find your blood glucose level shoots up really quickly. If you have the same amount of carbohydrate from another food at breakfast, the glucose response is going to be different. People need to understand that. They also need to understand that when we combine foods together, the glucose response changes. So if you have 40 grams of carbohydrate from a bowl of rice, what happens to your blood glucose level if you eat that same amount of carbohydrate with other foods in the meal is not going to be the same. It's really confusing for families if we teach them to carbohydrate count and they get different responses to the same amount of food because we haven't taught them that actually it's not only about the amount of carbohydrate, it's about what else is in the meal. So to help people to understand how food, insulin and glucose all fit together, it's not just the amount of carbohydrate and the insulin to carbohydrate ratio, it's understanding those other responses. So for me, the classic is pizza. We never tell a newly diagnosed child or family you can't eat pizza. We teach them what will happen the first time they have pizza before they go to bed, so the parents don't panic about the high blood glucose level in the middle of the night. The next time when they've established the blood glucose response, we may teach them how to manage it, but we make sure that they go away from that first initial week of education knowing that these things may happen. Within all that, we have to remember the context of healthy eating. We know that healthful food choices impact in the long term. We know that if we focus too much on amount of carbohydrate, we can end up with food choices that result in a lower quality of diet. So we can't just go count carbohydrate and eat what you like. We can say count carbohydrate and consider the whole of the diet and the food choices that you make. There are lots of different ways of illustrating the healthy diet. So we've got a Eat Well plate from the UK, a guide that I found whilst I was here this week. I think it's actually a maternal eating guide and a US guide. You will have local resources and they should be part of the education process. In the UK, children in school learn about the Eat Well plate. So we get that picture out in the middle of the education and the kids go, oh yeah, I've seen that before, I know what that is, from a really young age. It's also putting the education we're giving them in a more familiar context. It's something that they're used to seeing and thinking about. We also have to talk about the importance of routine. And again, Carmel talks about this morning. It's true for every insulin regimen for different reasons, but if we establish a good eating pattern, then blood glucose management is not as difficult. Grazing and eating constantly presents a constant challenge of hyperglycemia. So we need to encourage patterns of meals with small snacks and avoid grazing in the younger children. But in the older children, the adolescents, we actually need to think about what is a snack? When we say you can have a snack, what does that actually mean? Because I see young people who have a snack that contains more carbohydrate than their meal. And if as a first message what they've heard is, you have a snack, oh, you don't really need to take it, oh, if you're in a snacks, you only have to take insulin with your snack if it's this much. What they translate in here is, if I eat a snack, I don't need insulin. So I'm going to come home from school and I'm really hungry and I'm going to have this really big snack because I'm really hungry, but it's a snack, so I don't need insulin. So maybe we shouldn't talk about meals and snacks at all, we should talk about food and when food needs insulin to get over that hurdle. So it's not just talking about the eating pattern, it's thinking about the language we use. And then fad diets. I thought, well, what do I want to say about fad diets? What do we mean by a fad diet? And actually I thought maybe what we mean is, for me, is the impact of technology. So for those people who have access to technology, then they see the blood glucose responses to the food. And if they haven't been given the information to understand, they will go looking for the information. And as a result of that, they will come back to you doing all kinds of things that you may not think are so great. So maybe if we educate better so that people understand glucose responses to food, there will be less temptation to try the fad diets, to take the advice that we feel is not the best advice, because they understand how to manage food. Our parent support group in the UK a couple of years ago did a survey of parents to find out what they felt about management at diagnosis, and the overwhelming majority of responses were, we wanted to be taught more about food. We didn't want to wait for that education, we needed to understand it from day one. I was asked to talk about sweeteners. So all I'm going to say is it tells you in the new guideline about sweeteners and that they can be used in an appropriate way but shouldn't be used to excess. There are diagnosis education recommendations in the new chapter, and it's all about basing our education from the standpoint of what does the family do, how does the food fit into the context of the family's life, and then teaching them how to manage that food. Ideally, we'd want dietitians to be doing this, but we know not everywhere has dietitians to do this. So again, as I say, for those of you who maybe do not have a dietitian to work with, perhaps consider joining the nutrition group through the website so that you can have access to more resources that may be helpful. So I'm going to finally end up with this young man that we met a couple of weeks ago. Came in newly diagnosed, 10-year-old boy, with known learning difficulties. He had additional support in school, a single-parent family, and mum spoke very little English. Now, everybody in our team speaks English, and none of us have a second language. So for those of you who English is not your first language, you have my greatest respect. You sit here listening to this. And there was concern from the ward staff that we couldn't do our usual education because this mum was really going to struggle to understand. And there was some debate about what insulin regime should we use and what nutrition education should we give. So what did we do? We did MDI with carbohydrate counting, exactly as we always do. We did the food routine education because he was a snacker. We did the food choice education because there was some scope for improving the food choices of the family. We went, you have to give pre-meal insulin, even if you're not sure how much he's going to eat, you give some insulin pre-meal. We used food pictures. We used pictures for everything. The nurses used pictures to teach injection technique, pictures to teach the blood glucose meter use, pictures for everything. And we gave the family a blood glucose meter with a bolus calculator in there so that we could work out the carbohydrate and then enter that, and that would do the insulin dose calculation. Did it work? Well, I don't know what you think about that, but I think that's a pretty spectacular download after the first 2 weeks at home. This mum is doing amazingly well. This young man actually has a much better routine of eating now. We're just trying to get her to do slightly fewer blood glucose checks through the day and the night. But she's in an absolutely fantastic job. And I can think, because we looked at what she needed and thought, let's do what we normally do in a way that will work for this family. So in conclusion, we need the right education at the right time, delivered in the right way. If you would like to see any of the education materials we use in our clinical practice, you can download them all from our website. And you can come and get a card from me if you like with the web link on. So thank you very much, and that's the lovely bear I met in Alaska the other month.